You've been quiet lately. Not because you don't care. Not because you've stopped believing. But because you're tired. Tired of praying and hearing nothing. Tired of seeking and seeing no change. Tired of wondering if God is even listening anymore. There's a stillness in your spirit that you didn't choose. It crept in over time. Maybe it began after that door slammed shut. Maybe it started when your heart was shattered in a way no one else fully saw. Maybe it's been building for years. This ache, this silence, this longing for something more. And now you're here. Waiting. Worn. Wondering. You love God. And you've trusted Him. You've walked with Him. You've praised Him. And you've clung to His promises. But lately, it's like the heavens have gone quiet. You ask Him questions, but the answers don't come. You plead for a sign, and all you get is stillness. You read the Word, and even the pages seem to whisper silence. What do you do when the God who spoke the universe into existence suddenly stops speaking to you? That's where so many lose their way. Not in tragedy, not in loss, but in silence. Because silence is confusing. It makes you second-guess everything. Did I miss something? Did I disappoint Him? Did I go too far to be called back? And that's where the enemy loves to show up, with lies dressed in logic. If God were really with you, you'd know it by now. If you had more faith, He'd answer. Maybe He's done with you. But let me tell you something you need to hold close. The silence doesn't mean God is absent. It doesn't mean you've failed. It doesn't mean your story is over. Sometimes, the silence is part of the story. Think about it. Before creation, there was silence. Before resurrection, there was a tomb. Before breakthrough, there's often a waiting room. A space where God is still working, even when He's not speaking. You don't plant a seed and hear it growing. You don't see the roots taking hold in the dark. But something real is happening beneath the surface. In the same way, when God feels silent in your life, it could be because He's doing His deepest work. Not in the spotlight, but in the secret. Not in the noise, but in the stillness. What if the silence isn't about what God is withholding, but about what He's building? You see, God's silence is not a void. It's often a space filled with intention, a space where faith is formed, not by what we hear, but by who we trust. And trust isn't proven when everything makes sense. It's proven when nothing does, and you stay anyway. So if you've been walking through a quiet season, if you've been praying with tears and hearing only stillness, don't tune out. Because what feels like silence could be preparation. What seems like distance might actually be design. And in just a few moments, we're going to uncover what's really happening when God goes quiet. Why He allows the silence. What He's forming in you through it. And how to walk through this season without losing your faith or your fire. But before we dive in, let me ask you this. Could it be that the very silence you've been resenting is the space where your next level is being born? Let's talk about it. There's something sacred about silence. It's uncomfortable. It's unsettling. But it's also holy. Because silence, when it comes from God, is never empty. It's not meaningless. It's not wasted. God is not like us. When He's quiet, He's not ignoring. He's not passive-aggressive. He's not unsure of what to say. His silence is strategic. It carries weight, purpose, and power. And I want you to hear this deep in your spirit. When God is silent, it doesn't mean He's absent. It means He's at work in a way you can't yet see. Some of the most powerful moves of God begin in silence. Not in fire, not in thunder, not in loud, dramatic displays, but in quiet preparation. Because God is not just concerned about what happens around you. He's shaping what's happening inside you. We live in a world addicted to noise. We want constant feedback, instant answers, constant affirmation. But the kingdom of God works differently. God will often draw you into a season where the only voice you hear is your own echo, not to punish you, but to grow you. That's where trust is tested. That's where your faith either deepens or fades. That's where you begin to realize something powerful. You were never meant to live off constant reassurance. You were meant to live by faith. Think of Abraham. God promised him a son, then waited 25 years before delivering that promise. Think of David, anointed as king, yet spent years hiding in caves while Saul hunted him. Think of Jesus. The heavens split open at his baptism, and then the Spirit led him into the wilderness. In each of those moments, the silence was not the absence of destiny. It was the confirmation of it. But here's the truth most people don't want to face. Silence is the classroom of maturity. It's where spiritual infants cry out for noise and signs, while sons and daughters learn to walk by trust. So if you're in a season right now where God feels distant, if the word isn't hitting the same way, if your prayers seem to hang in the air with no reply, hear me clearly. This is not the end of your story. This is the place where your roots go deeper. This is the place where you begin to grow not by what you feel, but by what you know. Because here's what's really happening in the silence. God is positioning you. Sometimes we're so focused on what God should be saying that we miss what He's doing. He's rearranging relationships, closing doors, shifting your path, rebuilding what was broken inside you. And He's doing it in quiet because the work is delicate, sacred. God is preparing you. If He spoke too soon, you wouldn't be ready. If He showed you the whole picture now, it would overwhelm you. So instead, He draws back, not to distance Himself, but to strengthen your dependence. God is pruning you. Some things can't go with you to the next level. Old mindsets, unforgiveness, hidden pride, and in the silence, those things come to the surface. That's grace, not punishment. God is testing you, not to fail you, but to reveal you, to show you what's really in your heart, to see if you'll still trust Him when you don't hear Him. You see, anyone can praise when the blessing shows up, but it takes a surrendered heart to praise in the quiet, to say, God, even if I don't hear you right now, I will not walk away. I will wait. I will trust. I will stay faithful, because silence is not the absence of love. Sometimes, it's the evidence of it. A good father knows when to speak, and when to step back so his child can grow. And your Father, the one who created you, the one who called you, He sees the bigger picture. He's not being silent to frustrate you. He's being silent to form you, to make you stronger, deeper, more anchored. And when the time is right, when you're ready to carry what He's prepared, when the soil is rich and the roots are strong, the silence will break, not with chaos, not with confusion, but with clarity, power, and breakthrough. So I'll ask you this. Can you hold on in the quiet? Can you trust the God who spoke the universe into existence, even when He chooses not to speak for a while? Because if you can endure this season without losing your faith, if you can keep showing up, even when it feels like no one sees, if you can praise, even in the stillness, then you're about to walk into something greater than you imagined. But how do you navigate that kind of silence? How do you keep your faith alive when God feels far away? What does it look like to actually live through this, without losing yourself in the process? That's what we're about to uncover. Let's begin here, with something simple, but often misunderstood. God's call is rarely loud. It's not always dramatic. It's not usually a lightning bolt from heaven or a booming voice in the middle of the night. In fact, many times God's call is a quiet stirring, a gentle pull on your heart, a deep sense that you were made for something more, even when you can't quite explain it. But because we expect fireworks, many of us miss the invitation. We wait for clarity, but God is looking for faith. We want certainty, but God is building surrender. That's why the silence can feel so disorienting. We assume that if God's truly calling us, we'll hear Him loud and clear. But the truth is, many times, the call comes wrapped in uncertainty. And the silence isn't a sign that God has forgotten you. It's a space where He invites you to trust Him more deeply. Let me take you to a moment in Scripture that paints this perfectly. Moses, a man who would go on to lead a nation out of slavery, split the Red Sea, and speak with God face to face. But do you remember where it all began? Not in a palace, not in a temple, but on the backside of the wilderness, in silence, in obscurity. For 40 years, Moses lived in Midian, away from Egypt, away from his people, away from what he thought his life would be. He had once believed he was destined for something great, but now he was a shepherd, forgotten, unnoticed, and in that wilderness, I imagine he wondered, was that it? Did I miss my moment? And then, the burning bush, not a loud miracle, not thunder and lightning, just a bush on fire that didn't burn up. And when Moses turned aside to look, that's when God spoke. Don't miss that. God didn't shout to get Moses' attention. He used something quiet and strange enough to stir curiosity. And it was only when Moses moved toward the mystery that the voice of God met him. You see, God often waits for your attention before He releases His direction. So many people miss the call of God not because they're unworthy, but because they're distracted. Waiting for big signs, they overlook the small fires burning nearby. They don't realize the silence is part of the call, that the wilderness is where calling is clarified, that before God sends you to lead, He often sends you to listen. And if you feel like you've been stuck in that kind of wilderness, cut off from your purpose, going through the motions, unsure why God feels so distant, it could be that He's drawing you closer in a way that doesn't look like what you expected. Moses didn't receive the call in Pharaoh's court. He received it in the quiet. And when God finally spoke, Moses didn't jump up with confidence. He hesitated. He doubted. He listed every reason why he wasn't enough. I'm not a good speaker. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? What if they don't believe me? Sound familiar? We think if God is calling us, we'll feel ready. But in reality, the call often exposes our insecurity before it reveals our destiny. Because God isn't calling you based on your resume. He's calling you based on His purpose. He doesn't need your perfection. He needs your obedience. And here's where the silence matters most. If Moses hadn't learned to be still in the wilderness, if he hadn't learned to live in solitude, if he hadn't wrestled with his identity in obscurity, he wouldn't have been able to carry the weight of the assignment later on. God used the silence to strip away Moses' pride, to break his dependency on titles and influence, to teach him how to recognize a holy moment. The same is true for you. If you're in a season where the world feels quiet, where your purpose feels paused, where your prayers feel unanswered. Don't assume the call isn't there. It might be forming in the silence. God may be inviting you to stop waiting for a loud instruction and start paying attention to the quiet fire burning inside you. That restlessness you feel, that sense of, there has to be more, that ache that no promotion, no relationship, no success seems to satisfy, that's not frustration, that's calling. And just like Moses, you may feel unqualified. You may have a past you're ashamed of. You may doubt whether you've missed your window. But God isn't limited by your timeline. He calls people who stutter to speak with authority. He calls people who've failed to lead nations. He calls people in the wilderness, not in spite of it, but because of it. So if you're listening to this right now, and you've been feeling that quiet ache, if you've sensed something shifting in your spirit, but can't explain why, if the silence has made you question whether God still has a plan for you, let this be your reminder. God is still calling, and He hasn't changed His mind about you. But before He gives you the platform, He's shaping your posture. Before He gives you the influence, He's refining your integrity. Before He places the promise in your hand, He's making sure your heart can carry it. And that shaping often happens in silence. So don't despise it. Don't rush it. Don't run from it. Instead, lean into it. Turn aside. Look closer, because the bush may already be burning. And if you'll move toward the mystery, you may just hear the voice of God call your name again. There's something nobody likes to talk about, but it's woven into every powerful story God has ever written. The test. Before the promise, there is always a process. Before the blessing, there's almost always a battle. Before the victory, there is often a season of testing so deep, so confusing, so exhausting, that it feels like the blessing will never come. But here's the truth. If you're being tested, it's not because God is punishing you. It's because He's preparing you. He's not trying to break you. He's trying to build something in you that can survive the weight of the blessing to come. And if there's one story in Scripture that speaks directly to this, it's the life of Joseph. You probably know his story. A dreamer, a favored son, given a prophetic glimpse into his destiny. He would one day rule, lead, and carry influence beyond imagination. But what followed that dream wasn't promotion. It was betrayal. It was abandonment. It was slavery, false accusation, and years in a prison cell. Joseph didn't just go through a hard season. He went through a silent one, thrown in a pit by his own brothers, sold like property, wrongfully accused by the very people he served faithfully, forgotten by those he helped. And through it all, God said nothing. There were no angels to reassure him, no prophetic voices showing up in his cell, no heavenly visions reminding him, "Hey Joseph, this is just a test. Don't worry, the palace is coming." Just silence. And yet, God was with him. Again and again, Scripture repeats that phrase. And the Lord was with Joseph, even in the pit, even in the prison, even when it looked like the dream was dead. Because the silence didn't mean God had left. It meant God was shaping him. You see, Joseph had the gift, but he needed the character. He had the dream, but he needed the depth. He had the favor, but he needed the fire. Something that only comes from walking through what you don't understand and refusing to let go of what God promised. That's what testing does. It strips away the illusions. It exposes the fears. It reveals what you really believe about God when you're not getting your way. And that's what so many of us are experiencing right now. We've heard God speak. We've seen glimpses of the promise. We've felt the stirrings of a calling too big to explain. But now we're in the prison season, the pit season, the long, silent stretch where nothing seems to be moving and everything inside us is being pressed. And maybe you've asked, God, why did you show me the dream if you were just going to hide me? But what if the hiding is holy? What if the silence is the space where God is forging the steel you'll need for what's coming? Because make no mistake, blessing carries weight, and without the test, the blessing would crush you. Without the silence, you'd speak too soon. Without the prison, you'd rule without mercy. Joseph's test lasted years, but when the moment came, when the doors finally opened, it happened in a flash. 1 minute he was forgotten. The next, he was standing before Pharaoh, interpreting dreams and being handed authority over an entire nation. But don't miss what qualified him. It wasn't his ambition. It wasn't his connections. It was his faithfulness in the silence. Joseph didn't need the spotlight to serve with excellence. He didn't need recognition to walk in integrity. He didn't need applause to remain loyal to the God he couldn't see. And that's what God is looking for in you. Will you stay faithful even when the promise seems far away? Will you serve where you are, even when you think you should be further along? Will you keep your heart clean in the silence, so that when the doors open, you don't sabotage what God wants to give you? Because the test isn't just about survival. It's about refinement. It's about learning to lead in the dark before you're trusted in the light. It's about learning to worship in the prison before you're handed the keys to the kingdom. It's about learning that God's silence doesn't mean He's stopped speaking. It means He's watching to see how you respond. Anyone can obey when everything makes sense. But it's in the wilderness, the waiting, the weeping, that real obedience is forged. So if you're being tested right now, don't despise it. Lean into it. Ask God what He's showing you, not just what He's withholding from you. Because just like Joseph, your test may be the very thing that qualifies you for your next season. And when that season comes, when the silence breaks, it won't just bless you, it'll bless everyone around you. Joseph's faithfulness didn't just rescue him, it preserved nations. It restored families. It fulfilled prophecies. And I wonder, what is God preparing to release through you? What breakthrough, what generational shift, what healing, what legacy is waiting on the other side of your test? Don't rush it. Don't give up. Don't mistake God's silence for His absence. Because when the time is right, you won't have to chase the blessing. The blessing will come looking for you. And until then, keep walking. Keep serving. Keep listening. Even if all you hear is silence, trust that heaven is still writing your story. Sometimes the loudest silence in your life isn't coming from heaven. It's coming from inside you. Because while you're waiting on God to speak, God is waiting on you to break free from the chains that are choking your faith. Let's be honest. Some of us aren't just dealing with external delays. We're carrying internal prisons. Prisons made of fear, doubt, shame, regret. Chains that have wrapped around our identity and convinced us we're stuck, when God has already called us free. You may not be in a physical prison like Joseph, but there are prisons of the heart that are just as real. The prison of comparison, where you measure your journey against someone else's and always come up short. The prison of guilt, where past mistakes whisper, "You're disqualified." The prison of fear, where you stay silent because you're scared that stepping out will only lead to more disappointment. The prison of self-sabotage, where every time you get close to a breakthrough, you find a way to shut the door on yourself. And maybe that's why the silence has felt so suffocating. Because God isn't just trying to move in your circumstances. He's trying to deliver your mind. He's not just trying to shift your environment. He's trying to set your heart free. You've been praying for open doors, but the first thing God opens is your cage. And here's the truth you need to face. God could be silent right now, not because He's far from you, but because He's close, and He's digging deep. He's shining a light into the corners of your soul that you've tried to ignore, not to condemn you, not to embarrass you, but to liberate you. Because freedom isn't just the absence of bondage, it's the presence of healing. It's waking up without shame weighing you down. It's looking in the mirror and seeing someone God calls beloved, even on your worst day. It's choosing faith over fear, not just once, but every single morning. Let me tell you a story, a real one. There was a woman I met years ago. We'll call her Rachel. Rachel had a powerful calling on her life. She could speak with authority, connect with people deeply, and had a heart that burned for God. But for years, she stayed silent. Not because she didn't hear God, but because she believed she wasn't worthy of His voice. You see, Rachel had a past, one filled with failure, broken relationships, addiction, and shame. She believed that her mistakes were louder than her anointing. She believed that silence from God was His way of saying, "You blew it." So she stopped praying boldly. She stopped dreaming. She stopped showing up. And then one night, in worship, something broke. Not a sound from heaven, not a flash of light, just a quiet, undeniable realization deep in her soul. God never changed His mind about me. That was it. No sermon, no prophecy, just truth. And when she received that truth, something shifted. She began to speak again. She began to serve again. She began to believe again. And what followed? Doors opened. Healing flowed. Chains broke. Not just for her, but for others through her. Because sometimes the miracle doesn't begin with God speaking. It begins with you believing. And maybe that's what God is doing in your silence. Not punishing you, but purging you. Not holding out on you, but healing you. The voice of God is still near. You just have to make space to hear it over the noise of your inner critic. Because the enemy knows this. If he can't destroy your purpose, he'll try to distract your mind. He'll feed you lies in the silence. You're too far gone. No one will listen to you. God's done with you. But those are chains, and they were never meant to hold you. The cross already shattered them. The resurrection already declared your freedom. Now it's your turn to walk out of the cell and stop living like a prisoner when God calls you free. Look at Paul and Silas. They were thrown in prison for preaching the gospel, beaten, chained, surrounded by darkness. And yet, at midnight, they sang, not because the chains were already broken, but because they trusted the God who could break them. They praised in the silence, and that praise shook the earth. The chains fell, the doors opened, and not just for them, but for every prisoner around them. Do you see it? Your freedom isn't just about you. When you break free, you become a doorway for others. Your healing becomes someone else's hope. Your breakthrough becomes a beacon. So here's the question. What chains are you still carrying? What lie have you agreed with in the silence? What prison has become so familiar, you've started calling it home? It's time to confront it. Not in your strength, but in His. Not with fear, but with faith. You don't have to live afraid. You don't have to hide from your past. You don't have to wait for permission to walk in freedom. God already gave it. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the silence has been about all along. Not rejection, but revelation. God has been showing you who you really are. Not who your past says you are. Not who your failure says you are. But who He created you to be. And when you embrace that, when you believe that in the quiet, you'll hear something rise in your spirit again. Hope, fire, boldness. And suddenly, the silence won't feel like a punishment anymore. It'll feel like the sacred space where you found your voice again. There comes a moment in every walk with God when the silence lifts, not because the circumstances have changed, but because you have. It's the moment when fear no longer has the final word, when doubt doesn't dictate your next step, when the voice that once whispered, "You're not ready," is drowned out by the deeper truth rising from within. God is with you, and you've been prepared for this. This is the moment when you step into divine power. Not a power that comes from position or popularity. Not a power that needs to be seen or praised. But the kind of power that flows from surrender. The kind of power that shows up when you've walked through the silence, wrestled with your insecurities, and refused to let go of God's hand. Think of Peter, a fisherman, flawed, impulsive. The same Peter who sank when he took his eyes off Jesus. The same Peter who denied him 3 times. The same Peter who hid in fear after the crucifixion. And yet, after all of that, Jesus didn't cast him aside. He restored him. He empowered him. And on the day of Pentecost, that same Peter stood up and preached with boldness. And thousands came to faith. But go back for a moment, before the fire, before the crowds. Go back to that night on the water. Jesus had sent his disciples across the sea. The winds picked up. The waves raged. And then, sometime between midnight and morning, they saw a figure walking toward them on the water. They were terrified, thought it was a ghost. But Jesus said, "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter, still impulsive, still hungry, replied, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come." And Jesus simply said, "Come." That's it. One word. No guarantees. No safety net. No step-by-step plan. Just, come. And Peter stepped out of the boat. Understand this. He wasn't walking on water. He was walking on a word. That's what divine power looks like. Not walking in your own strength, but trusting that when Jesus calls you, he also sustains you. Peter only began to sink when he shifted his focus from the one who called him to the storm around him. That's where many of us are right now. God has whispered, "Come, come out of comfort, come out of fear, come out of the background, come into the purpose you were created for." And we've taken a step, maybe 2, but then the wind picked up. The silence came back. And now we're wondering, did I make a mistake? But listen, God didn't call you to drown. He called you to walk. And even if you stumble, he will catch you. Because divine power doesn't mean you won't feel afraid. It means fear doesn't stop you anymore. It means that the silence no longer defines you. It means you've come to know the voice of God so intimately that even when he's quiet, you trust his heart. Divine power looks like this. You keep moving when there's no applause. You keep giving when you feel empty. You keep believing even when heaven seems still. It's not loud. It's not flashy. It's steady, rooted, relentless. It's the power of someone who's been through the fire and didn't quit. Of someone who's been tested and didn't walk away. Of someone who didn't wait for every question to be answered before saying, "Yes, Lord, I'll go." That's what God is developing in you right now. You didn't walk through the silence for nothing. You didn't survive the pit and the prison just to go back to who you used to be. This is your launch season. Not because everything is perfect, but because something inside you has been awakened. You've seen too much to stay quiet. You've waited too long to give up now. You've come too far to shrink back into fear. And even if you feel shaky, even if the boat feels safer than the water, even if every voice in your head says, "Stay where it's safe," there's a voice louder than all the rest. Come. It's time. It's time to speak what God placed in you. It's time to step into rooms you once felt unworthy of. It's time to lead, to serve, to heal, to pour out. Not because you have all the answers, but because you've learned to listen in the silence. Not because you're perfect, but because you've been formed by the process. This is not the end of your wilderness. It's the beginning of your walk. And as you move, you'll see things shift. You'll watch doors open. You'll witness prayers answered that you forgot you even prayed. Because divine power flows through surrendered vessels. Vessels who say, "Even when I don't understand, I'll go. Even when I feel unqualified, I'll trust. Even when God is silent, I'll believe." So step out, not just with your feet, but with your faith, with your voice, with your obedience. God isn't waiting for you to be fearless. He's waiting for you to move anyway. And when you do, the water beneath your feet will hold you. The silence will make sense. And the power of God will carry you places your fear never could. This is your moment. Not tomorrow. Not when things are clearer. Not when the fear goes away. Right now, this very moment, is holy ground. Because you've heard the truth, not just in words, but in your spirit. You know that the silence hasn't been empty. You know that the delays haven't been wasted. You know that the ache in your heart has been more than frustration. It's been God calling you deeper. And now comes the question heaven has been waiting for you to answer. What will you do with this moment? Will you go back to comfort? Will you keep waiting for another sign, another word, another confirmation? Or will you trust what's already been planted in you? Because the truth is, you already know the next step. Maybe it's small, maybe it scares you, but it's there, and God is saying, move. Some of you need to stop asking, God speak, and start saying, God, I'm listening, because He has been speaking, in the silence, in the stirring, in the late-night whispers and the quiet convictions. He's been calling your name, not with a shout, but with a gentle pull. And today, heaven is waiting on your yes. Yes to obedience. Yes to surrender. Yes to walking when you still don't see the full path. Don't let this be another message that stirs your heart and then fades into the noise. This is more than encouragement. This is a turning point. You've been asking for breakthrough. Now God is asking for your bravery. You've wanted the outcome. Now He's asking for your obedience. This is your Red Sea moment. Will you step forward before the waters part? This is your Peter moment. Will you get out of the boat while the wind still blows? This is your Joseph moment. Will you stay faithful in the prison so God can trust you with the palace? And maybe you're saying, I want to, but I'm scared. That's okay. Courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you believe God is bigger than the fear. Faith isn't about knowing everything. It's about trusting the one who does. And if all you can say today is, God, I'll go with you even if I don't feel ready, He will meet you there, because He's not looking for perfection. He's looking for your surrender. He's not asking for flawless faith, just a willing heart. You've walked through silence. You've endured the test. You've let him strip the chains and refine your identity. Now it's time to rise. No more waiting for someone else to validate you. No more hiding behind excuses or delay. No more rehearsing the reasons why it's too late, too hard, or too soon. It's your time to move forward, to walk into the unknown with confidence that you are not alone. The same God who was with Moses in the wilderness, the same God who stood with Joseph in the prison, the same God who reached for Peter on the water, is with you right now. He never stopped working. He never stopped loving you. He never stopped believing in who He created you to be. You were born for this, not just to survive, not just to wait in fear, but to move with power, to speak with boldness, to live with purpose. The silence was never a sentence. It was a setup, a sacred space where God was building the strength, the fire, and the faith you would need for what's next. So take the step. Start the thing He put in your heart. Speak the words He's placed in your mouth. Break the pattern. Forgive. Rebuild. Trust again. Hope again. Obey again. Because what you're stepping into is greater than what you're walking out of, and the weight of the silence will not compare to the glory that's coming. This is your moment. Will you walk away unchanged, or will you say yes and step into the life heaven has been preparing for you all along? You made it through the silence, and maybe for the first time, you're realizing that silence wasn't a void. It was a holy space. It was a wilderness, yes, but not a wasteland. It was where God met you without distractions, without noise, without performance. It was where you found Him, not in thunder, not in signs, but in stillness. And that stillness, it shaped you, because something happens when you keep walking through the quiet. You stop being shaken by every unanswered prayer. You stop defining your worth by your circumstances. You begin to walk, not by what you feel, but by who you know God to be. That's real maturity. That's real power. That's the kind of faith that moves mountains and silences storms, not because of how loud it is, but because of how deep it runs. And now, here you are, standing on the other side of the silence, stronger, clearer, rooted, not because the road was easy, but because you didn't quit. Let that settle in. You didn't quit. When the heavens felt closed, you kept praying. When the doors stayed shut, you stayed faithful. When the answers didn't come, you kept believing. That matters. It may not have been noticed by others. There may have been no one cheering you on in the secret place. But heaven saw it. God honored it. And in due time, the same God who was silent will speak, not just in whispers, but in waves, not just in hints, but in undeniable moments of favor and clarity, not just for you, but through you. You're going to be a voice for others walking through their own silence. You're going to carry oil from the crushing, wisdom from the waiting, and fire from the furnace. And when people ask, "How did you make it through?" you'll say, "Because I learned to trust God when I couldn't trace Him." So what now? Now, you keep going. You keep showing up to the secret place. You keep living with expectation. You keep speaking when He says speak, and resting when He says wait. Because from this day forward, you're not walking as someone looking for validation. You're walking as someone already chosen, already seen, already marked. And what God has planned for your life, it's greater than what you're leaving behind. It's deeper than the silence you endured. It's bigger than the fear that tried to hold you down. You're stepping into a new season, one marked by divine power, supernatural clarity, and unshakable faith. So lift your head, take a breath, and get ready, because eyes haven't seen, ears haven't heard, and hearts haven't imagined what God is about to do through you. The silence was not the end. It was the beginning of something eternal. Your breakthrough is closer than you think. Your purpose is more alive than it's ever been. And your God, He's been with you every step of the way. So keep moving forward. The voice you were waiting for is rising from within. If this spoke to your heart, if you've been walking through your own silent season, I want to hear from you, not just for me, but because your story might be the very thing someone else needs to hear. You don't have to share everything, just a sentence, a prayer, a moment where God met you in the stillness, because we are not meant to walk this journey alone, and sometimes, knowing someone else understands can be the first crack of light in a dark room. So share your testimony, share your process. Let this space be more than a comment section. Let it be an altar, a place where faith rises and chains fall. And if you're still in the middle of the silence, not sure what to say, just write, "I'm still trusting Him." That one line could shake something loose for someone else. It could remind them they're not the only one waiting, and it could be the first act of faith in your next chapter. We're in this together, and I believe with all my heart, your next move of God is already unfolding. So stay with Him, stay expectant, and let's walk this journey, one silent, surrendered, faith-filled step at a time. This narration was generated by AI, but the message itself carries timeless truth and power.